Professor Clicks adjusted his safety goggles for the third time in 2 minutes, all three of his eyes blinking in sequence like a nervous traffic light. The Galactic Academy's safety protocol classroom was his domain, his sanctuary, his perfectly climate-controlled bubble of preventative measures and emergency procedures. Every surface was padded, every corner rounded, and every potentially dangerous object secured behind no fewer than 4 different types of locks. Welcome to Safety Fundamentals 101. Clicks announced to his newest batch of exchange students, his voice carrying that particular tremor of someone who had seen too many incident reports. I am Professor Clicks, and I have been teaching safety protocols for over 30 standard years without a single major injury in my classroom. He paused to knock on the reinforced polymer desk, because even alien academics weren't immune to superstition. The classroom was filled with the usual suspects. A nervous vegan whose skin changed colors based on stress levels, currently cycling through what looked like a mood ring on steroids. 2 Centaurian twins who kept finishing each other's sentences and probably each other's safety checklists. A crystalline being from the Silicate Nebula who made tiny tinkling sounds every time they moved, like a living wind chime with anxiety. And then there was the human. Jake Murphy sat in the back row, looking about as interested as someone watching paint dry in slow motion. He was slouched in his chair with the kind of casual confidence that made Professor Clicks's mandibles twitch nervously. The human wore what appeared to be a simple fabric covering and some kind of primitive foot protection, no visible safety equipment whatsoever. Clicks had read the briefing files on humans, of course, but seeing one in person was different. They looked so fragile, soft, breakable. Now then, Clicks continued, pulling up his holographic presentation, as beings from various worlds with different atmospheric compositions, gravity levels, and environmental hazards, it is crucial that we understand the basic principles of staying alive in unfamiliar surroundings. He clicked to the first slide, which showed a cheerful cartoon alien wearing approximately 17 different types of protective gear. Safety first, safety always, safety forever. This is our motto here at the Academy. Jake raised his hand lazily. Question, Professor. How long is this class exactly? 16 weeks of comprehensive safety training, Clicks replied proudly. We cover everything from proper breathing apparatus maintenance to emergency evacuation procedures for no fewer than 47 different types of disasters. 47. Jake's eyebrows rose slightly. That's oddly specific. Well, there used to be 48, Clicks admitted, but we removed death by chocolate after we discovered that was only lethal to canids, and they're not allowed in the Academy cafeteria anyway. He cleared his throat nervously. Moving on. Today we'll start with the absolute basics: environmental awareness, emergency protocols, and the fundamental principle that when in doubt, evacuate immediately and call for professional help. The human nodded slowly, but Professor Clicks caught something in his expression that looked suspiciously like amusement, which was concerning. Because in Clicks's experience, beings who found safety protocols amusing were usually the ones who ended up in the incident reports. Excellent, Professor Clicks said, rubbing his hands together with the enthusiasm of someone about to demonstrate the proper way to put on a seatbelt. Let's begin with our first practical exercise. Environmental hazard simulation number 1. Minor atmospheric pressure deviation. He gestured grandly toward a sealed chamber at the front of the classroom, complete with viewing windows and enough warning labels to wallpaper a small moon. This simulation will show you the proper response to a routine atmospheric leak, Clicks explained, his 3 eyes gleaming with educational fervor. Remember, when faced with any emergency, the correct procedure is to remain calm, follow evacuation protocols in an orderly fashion, and wait for qualified emergency personnel to resolve the situation. The vegan student's skin had already shifted to a concerning shade of yellow-green. Professor, shouldn't we be wearing protective equipment for this? Nonsense. Clicks waved a dismissive tentacle. This is merely a harmless simulation. The chamber will experience a minor pressure drop. The safety systems will activate, and we'll observe proper emergency response procedures from the comfort of our padded observation area. Jake Murphy stretched in his chair like a cat waking up from a nap. What kind of pressure drop are we talking about here? Oh, nothing dramatic. Just enough to trigger the safety protocols. Perhaps a 5% deviation from standard atmospheric pressure. Professor Clicks pressed a button on his control panel with the confidence of someone who had done this demonstration hundreds of times before. What happened next was not a 5% deviation. The simulation chamber didn't just lose pressure, it practically inhaled itself. Warning lights that had never been designed to flash began strobing like an alien disco. The viewing windows started making concerning creaking sounds that definitely weren't in the safety manual. Oh my, Professor Clicks said, which in academic circles is basically equivalent to screaming in terror. His 3 eyes darted frantically between multiple control panels as error messages scrolled by faster than he could read them. This is most irregular. The Centaurian twins were already halfway to the exit, finishing each other's panic in perfect synchronization. "We need to evacuate," said one. "Immediately," finished the other. The crystalline student was making wind chime sounds that would probably haunt Professor Clix's dreams for weeks. "Everyone please proceed to the nearest emergency exit in an orderly fashion," Clix announced, trying to maintain some semblance of academic authority while simultaneously having what could generously be called a controlled breakdown. "This is not part of the planned demonstration." Meanwhile, Jake Murphy had gotten up from his chair and was walking toward the malfunctioning chamber. Not away from it. Toward it. "Hey, where are you going?" Professor Clix called out, his voice hitting octaves that probably violated several noise ordinances. "The evacuation procedure clearly states that all personnel should move away from potential hazards." Jake paused at the control panel, looked at the scrolling error messages for about 3 seconds, then reached underneath the console and gave something a solid thunk with his fist. The warning lights stopped flashing, the creaking stopped creaking, the error messages disappeared, replaced by a cheerful green status indicator that read System Normal. "There we go," Jake said, dusting off his hands. "Classic percussive maintenance. Works every time." Professor Clix stared at him with all 3 eyes wide enough to use as satellite dishes. "You fixed a catastrophic system failure by hitting it." "Well, yeah. Looked like a stuck relay in the pressure regulation system. Sometimes you just need to give it a little encouragement." Jake shrugged like he'd just fixed a squeaky door instead of preventing what could have been a classroom-sized disaster. "My dad's a mechanic. You'd be surprised how many problems can be solved with the right application of force in the right place." The other students had stopped their orderly evacuation, and were now staring at Jake like he'd just performed actual magic. Which, from their perspective, he basically had. Professor Clix made a note on his tablet. A very long note. The kind of note that would probably require its own incident report. After what Professor Clix generously termed a brief intermission to recalibrate everyone's stress levels, the class relocated to the Academy's demonstration kitchen. This was Clix's second favorite teaching environment, primarily because it had more fire suppression systems than a military bunker and enough safety equipment to stock a small hospital. "Food safety," Professor Clix announced, gesturing toward a wall display that looked like a periodic table crossed with a most wanted poster, "is perhaps the most critical survival skill for interspecies interaction. What is nutritious for one species can be absolutely lethal for another." He pointed to a section of the display marked with enough warning symbols to give a hazmat technician nightmares. "These are Earth spices. Capsaicin-based compounds that humans somehow classify as food additives despite their obvious applications as chemical weapons." The vegan student, whose skin had finally returned to a normal shade of blue-green, raised a tentacle nervously. "Professor, why would any species willingly consume toxins?" "An excellent question that has puzzled xenobiologists for decades," Clix replied. "Current theories range from evolutionary adaptation to collective insanity." Jake Murphy cleared his throat. "Actually, I brought some hot sauce from home if anyone wants to try it." He reached into what humans apparently called a backpack and pulled out a small bottle with a label that featured a cartoon skeleton wearing a sombrero. The warning text was in at least 6 different languages, which was either very thoughtful or very ominous. Professor Clix's middle eye began twitching. "Student Murphy, Academy regulations clearly state that unregistered food substances are prohibited in educational environments." "It's just hot sauce," Jake said with the kind of innocent expression that had probably gotten him out of trouble his entire life. "See, watch." He unscrewed the cap, which released a scent that made every alien in the room take an involuntary step backward. Without any apparent concern for his continued existence, Jake tilted the bottle and poured a generous amount onto his finger. "No, wait, don't," Professor Clix started to say, but Jake had already put his finger in his mouth. The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for moments right before explosions or right after someone says something incredibly stupid. Every alien in the room watched Jake's face, waiting for signs of imminent death, spontaneous combustion, or at minimum some indication that he was experiencing the effects of consuming what was essentially liquid pain. Instead, Jake smiled. "Not bad. Could use more heat though." The crystalline student made a sound like breaking glass mixed with a tea kettle having an existential crisis. "More heat?" Professor Clix whispered, his voice barely audible. "You want it to be more dangerous?" "Well, yeah. This is only about a 6 on the Scoville scale. Back home, I've got some ghost pepper sauce that'll really clear your sinuses." Jake recapped the bottle like he was discussing the weather. "Humans actually seek out spicy food. We have eating contests to see who can handle the hottest peppers. There's this one called the Carolina Reaper that's basically edible torture, and people line up to try it. The Centaurian twins exchanged a look that somehow managed to convey both horror and fascination. "You inflict pain on yourselves," said one. "For entertainment," finished the other. "Among other things, yeah. We also jump out of perfectly good aircraft for fun, drive vehicles at dangerous speeds for sport, and climb mountains just because they're there." Jake shrugged. "Humans are weird like that." Professor Klix was frantically scribbling notes again. At this rate, he was going to need a bigger tablet, and possibly a therapist. "Perhaps," Professor Klix said, his voice carrying the strained cheerfulness of someone clinging to their lesson plan like a life preserver, "we should move on to fire safety protocols. Surely this is one area where proper procedure is universally applicable." The class relocated to the Academy's fire safety training room, which looked like someone had crossed a laboratory with a bunker and then added enough emergency equipment to supply a small city. Red emergency lights lined every wall, fire suppression nozzles hung from the ceiling like mechanical stalactites, and enough foam dispensers to fight a small war were strategically positioned throughout the space. "Fire safety is quite straightforward," Professor Klix explained, gesturing toward a controlled demonstration setup. "When confronted with combustion, the proper response is immediate evacuation followed by activation of automated suppression systems. Under no circumstances should untrained personnel attempt to combat flames directly." He pressed a button, and a small contained fire began burning in a specially designed chamber. "Observe how the detection systems activate the suppression protocols." Except the suppression protocols didn't activate. Instead, sparks began shooting out of one of the wall-mounted control panels, and what started as a demonstration fire began spreading to definitely non-demonstration areas. "Oh dear," Professor Klix said, which was becoming his catchphrase for the day. "This is most irregular. Everyone please proceed to emergency exits in an orderly fashion while I contact the fire safety department." The alien students needed no further encouragement. The vegan was already color shifting through panic rainbow, the Centaurian twins were evacuating in perfect synchronized formation, and the crystalline being was making sounds like a fire alarm having a nervous breakdown. Jake Murphy, however, was moving in the wrong direction again. "Student Murphy," Professor Klix called out while frantically pressing emergency contact buttons. "The evacuation route is that way toward the exits, away from the rapidly expanding fire situation." "Yeah, I see it," Jake replied, grabbing what appeared to be a standard fire extinguisher from the wall. "But someone should probably put this out before it gets to those chemical storage cabinets." "The fire suppression system will handle it," Professor Klix insisted, though his voice suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of this himself. "Your fire suppression system is currently contributing to the problem," Jake pointed out, as indeed one of the malfunctioning sprinkler heads was now shooting sparks instead of water. "Besides, it's just a Class A fire, pretty straightforward." Without waiting for permission, proper authorization, or any of the 17 different safety clearances that Academy policy required, Jake pulled the pin on the fire extinguisher and walked directly toward the flames. "No, wait, stop," Professor Klix pleaded. "Untrained personnel should never attempt direct fire suppression. There are protocols, procedures, trained professionals who handle these situations." Jake paused in his firefighting efforts just long enough to look back at the professor. "You know, back on Earth, we deal with fires pretty regularly. Forest fires, house fires, industrial accidents. My neighbor Bob fought a grease fire in his kitchen last Tuesday, using a pot lid and some baking soda. This is actually pretty tame by comparison." He returned to systematically extinguishing the flames with the kind of casual competence that suggested he'd done this before, multiple times. "Your neighbor Bob is not certified in fire suppression techniques," Professor Klix protested weakly. "No, but he watches a lot of cooking shows and has decent reflexes." Jake finished putting out the last of the flames and checked the area for hot spots like he was following some internal checklist. "You should probably get your fire suppression system looked at though. I think the control circuit got fried when the first malfunction caused a feedback loop in the secondary systems." Professor Klix stared at him. "How do you know about feedback loops in fire suppression systems?" "YouTube," Jake replied, as if this explained everything. Which from a human perspective it probably did. The other students were slowly filing back into the room, staring at Jake like he'd just wrestled a dragon and won. Which, considering their perspective on fire, wasn't entirely inaccurate. Professor Klix's note-taking had evolved beyond frantic scribbling into what could only be described as academic panic writing. By this point in the day, Professor Klix had developed what humans might recognize as stress-induced eye twitching. Except he had 3 eyes, so the effect was particularly dramatic. His carefully planned curriculum was in shambles, his classroom equipment was developing trust issues, and his human student seemed to be operating under the assumption that danger was some kind of recreational activity. "Perhaps," he said, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone clinging to the last shreds of their sanity, "we should discuss recreational safety." Surely this is an area where species differences are minimal. The class had reconvened in what the Academy optimistically called the Physical Education Safety Orientation Room. It was essentially a padded gymnasium with enough safety equipment to make a bubble wrap factory jealous. The walls were lined with holographic displays showing approved low-impact activities for various species, most of which involve sitting quietly and perhaps mild stretching under professional supervision. Recreational activities, Professor Klix began, consulting his increasingly disheveled notes, should be selected based on species-appropriate risk assessment. Here at the Academy, we recommend meditation, gentle walking, and supervised breathing exercises as the safest forms of physical activity for most species. The vegan student, whose skin had finally settled into a cautious shade of pale green, raised a tentacle. What about competitive activities, Professor? Are there any interspecies sports that are considered safe? Excellent question. We do have sanctioned competitive meditation and synchronized breathing competitions. The Galactic Safety Council has also approved competitive flower arranging, though participants are required to wear protective gloves due to the potential for thorn-related injuries. Jake Murphy, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange, raised his hand. What about contact sports? Professor Klix's middle eye began that familiar twitching dance. Contact sports are strictly prohibited in Academy facilities due to the obvious injury potential. Even accidental physical contact between different species can result in serious harm. Huh, Jake said, leaning back in his chair with that expression that Professor Klix was beginning to recognize as a harbinger of educational disaster. So you guys don't have anything like rugby? Rugby? The crystalline student made a curious tinkling sound. Is that a form of meditation? Jake's grin was the kind that probably should have come with its own warning label. Not exactly. Rugby is a sport where two teams of really big guys try to carry a ball to opposite ends of a field, while the other team tries to stop them by tackling them to the ground. The silence that followed was profound enough to have its own gravitational field. Tackling. Professor Klix whispered, as if saying the word too loudly might summon actual rugby players into his classroom. Yeah, you know, grabbing someone and bringing them down. It's all perfectly legal as long as you don't grab their head or kick them when they're down. Well, mostly legal anyway. Jake was warming to his subject in the way that humans do when discussing things they're passionate about, which in this case was apparently organized violence. Then there's American football, which is like rugby, but with more protective equipment and more complicated rules about when you're allowed to hit people. The Centaurian twins were making synchronized whimpering sounds. But the really fun contact sport is hockey, Jake continued, apparently oblivious to the growing horror on his audience's faces. You strap knives to your feet, grab a stick, and chase a rubber disc around on ice while trying to hit it into a goal. Sometimes you hit other players instead, but that's part of the game. Knives, Professor Klix repeated faintly. On your feet. Ice skates. Yeah, and the stick is for hitting the puck. But if someone's being a jerk, you might cross-check them into the boards. Nothing personal, just part of the sport. The vegan student's skin was cycling through colors that probably didn't exist in nature. And humans do this voluntarily. Oh yeah, kids start playing when they're like 5 or 6. My little sister plays for her school team. She's only 12, but she's got a wicked slap shot, and she's not afraid to drop the gloves if someone gets too aggressive with her teammates. Drop the gloves? Professor Klix asked, though he clearly didn't want to know the answer. Fighting. Sometimes in hockey, you just have to settle things the old-fashioned way. The refs let you fight for a bit, then they separate you and you sit in the penalty box for 5 minutes. Jake paused, seeming to notice the collective traumatized stare of his classmates for the first time. But that's not even the dangerous stuff. You want to talk about extreme sports? There's base jumping, where you jump off cliffs with a parachute. Free climbing, where you scale vertical rock faces without ropes. Whitewater rafting down Class 5 rapids. Skydiving, bungee jumping, wingsuit flying. Wingsuit flying. The crystalline being's voice had gone up about 3 octaves. You wear a suit with fabric wings and jump out of an airplane, then glide through the air at like 120 miles per hour. Sometimes you fly through mountain passes or between buildings. The really crazy guys do proximity flying, where you get as close as possible to the ground or obstacles without actually hitting them. Professor Klix had stopped taking notes. His tablet had probably reached its storage limit for expressions of existential dread anyway. So let me understand this correctly, he said slowly. Humans engage in activities that involve intentional physical violence, deliberately jumping from great heights, and flying at dangerous speeds in close proximity to solid objects. And you consider these to be recreational activities? Pretty much. Yeah. Jake shrugged. Life's short, might as well make it interesting. My grandpa always said, If you're not living on the edge, you're taking up too much space. The Academy's recreational safety orientation room had never felt quite so inadequately equipped to handle its current educational challenge. Professor Kleck sat heavily in his reinforced safety chair, staring at his tablet screen, which was now displaying what could only be described as the academic equivalent of a cry for help. His three eyes were no longer blinking in sequence but rather in random patterns, like a broken traffic control system. The carefully structured lesson plan that had taken him months to develop lay in ruins, much like his faith in the basic survival instincts of supposedly intelligent species. "So," he said slowly, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who had just discovered that everything they thought they knew about the universe was fundamentally wrong. "Let me make sure I understand the situation correctly." The alien students were huddled together in what humans might recognize as a trauma support group configuration. The vegan skin had settled into a sort of distressed beige color that suggested their chromatic emotional responses had simply given up trying to keep pace with the day's revelations. The Centaurian twins were no longer finishing each other's sentences, primarily because they appeared to have achieved some kind of telepathic state of shared horror. The crystalline being was making soft tinkling sounds that sounded less like wind chimes and more like someone gently sobbing into a chandelier. Jake Murphy, meanwhile, looked perfectly relaxed, like someone who had spent a pleasant afternoon discussing the weather rather than systematically dismantling every concept of rational safety planning that the Galactic Academy had developed over the past 3 centuries. "Humans," Professor Klex continued, consulting his notes with the desperate attention of someone trying to make sense of an alien language, "regularly consume what other species classify as chemical weapons for recreational purposes. You intentionally engage in activities that involve high-speed impact with solid surfaces. You voluntarily expose yourselves to extreme temperatures, dangerous altitudes, and situations where serious injury or death are not just possible but statistically probable." "That's a pretty fair summary," Jake agreed cheerfully. "And when confronted with emergency situations, rather than following established safety protocols designed by trained professionals over decades of careful study, you prefer to improvise solutions using what you call percussive maintenance and information acquired from something called YouTube." "YouTube's actually a pretty good learning resource," Jake said. "You can learn almost anything there. Last month I learned how to replace a transmission, make sourdough bread, and perform basic field surgery, all from the same channel." Professor Klex made a sound that wasn't quite a whimper but wasn't quite a scream either. It was the sound of an academic realizing that their entire field of expertise had just been rendered obsolete by a species that treated danger like a hobby. "The problem," he said, more to himself than to his students, "is that you don't need safety lessons because you are the safety hazard. How do you write safety protocols for a species that considers risk management to be a form of entertainment?" "Now that's not entirely fair," Jake protested, with the kind of gentle correction usually reserved for minor misunderstandings rather than existential academic crises. "Humans are actually pretty careful about safety. We wear helmets when we ride motorcycles, we use safety harnesses when we climb mountains, and we have extensive training programs for dangerous occupations." As if to illustrate his point about human caution and awareness, Jake suddenly shot out of his chair with reflexes that would have made a hunting cat jealous. His hand darted upward, and caught a heavy equipment panel that had apparently been slowly working itself loose from the ceiling during the day's various equipment failures. The panel, which probably weighed about 30 pounds and contained enough sharp edges to require its own warning label, had been directly above where the crystalline student was sitting. If it had fallen, it would have turned the poor being into what could only be described as a very expensive and tragic wind chime memorial. Jake held the panel for a moment, examining the mounting brackets with the kind of casual interest usually reserved for checking the weather. "Yeah, these safety bolts are completely stripped. Probably been working loose for weeks. You might want to have maintenance check all the ceiling-mounted equipment in here." He carefully set the panel aside, making sure it was stable and couldn't fall on anyone, then sat back down as if nothing had happened. The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for moments of religious revelation or immediate post-disaster shock. Every alien in the room stared at Jake with expressions that suggested they were witnessing something that didn't quite fit into their understanding of how the universe was supposed to work. "How?" Professor Klex whispered, his voice barely audible. "Did you know that was going to fall?" Jake shrugged. "Heard the mounting bracket creaking when the building settled. Metal fatigue has a pretty distinctive sound, and the vibration pattern was all wrong. Plus you could see the stress fractures in the ceiling panel if you knew what to look for. But you were engaged in conversation. You weren't even looking at the ceiling." "Situational awareness," Jake explained as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "You learn to keep track of your environment, especially in potentially dangerous situations. It's just basic survival instinct." Professor Klex looked down at his tablet, then at his carefully planned curriculum, then at the human student who had just casually prevented what would have been a serious injury while simultaneously explaining that his species treated mortal danger as a recreational activity. Slowly, deliberately, he deleted his presentation files. "Class dismissed," he announced. "I need to completely redesign this course." As the alien students filed out in various states of existential bewilderment, Professor Klex began typing a new course description: Advanced Safety Protocols 201. How to survive in the vicinity of humans. Prerequisites include basic trauma counseling and advanced equipment maintenance. Warning: this course may fundamentally alter your understanding of risk assessment and survival instincts. Jake paused at the door. "Same time next week, Professor." Professor Klex looked up from his tablet, his three eyes blinking in what might have been the beginning of a nervous breakdown or possibly the early stages of enlightenment. "Actually, Student Murphy, I think next week I'll be attending your classes instead. I have a feeling there's a lot more I need to learn about human safety practices." Jake grinned. "Cool. Tomorrow's introduction to human transportation methods. We're covering motorcycles, race cars, and something called parkour." Professor Klex made a note to update his insurance policy, and started shopping for a stronger type of safety chair.